A new direction for the Chi Life YouTube channel. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. So this is an announcement that I'm pretty excited about. I'm excited with how this project is going and you know how it's gone so far and hopefully where it might head to. And we'll see. Hopefully you might get excited about it too. So I am going to start doing a podcast on this Chi Life YouTube channel and having interesting conversations with interesting people in quite a long format. So to begin with, I'm going to be aiming for the interviews to be around an hour. Some of them will be longer, some of them will be shorter. That's what we're aiming at for now. That could change in the future. We might find that a shorter or longer format is even better. But for now, we're aiming for about an hour, talking to interesting people about interesting things, and having that long format gives plenty of time to get into details and to hear about their experiences and knowledge and perspective on things. Now, why am I doing this? It's actually something that I've kind of been planning to do for a while, but it started to crystallize more lately. Those of you who've been following this Chi Life YouTube channel for a while might remember that way back before the pandemic started, I actually did an interview like this on the channel, and I was planning to do more, and I think I probably mentioned, hey, I'm planning to do more of these. And then this little thing got in the way and kind of disrupted a lot of plans for lots of us all around the world. And so as a result, I haven't continued with that. Now, at that stage, I wasn't necessarily planning for it to be a podcast, but I was planning to start doing interviews. And specifically, again, if you think way back then, I was in the process of relocating. I was leaving New Zealand. I was going to be setting up somewhere else. I had, well, a whole lot of travel planned, a bunch of retreats planned in different locations and intensive trainings, and I was going to be moving around quite a bit and meeting interesting people, and I thought this is going to be a great opportunity to interview some of them, and so introduce them to you and have interesting conversations about interesting things. And that kind of got a bit derailed, and my thinking at that time was mainly to, you know, they would just be episodes on the YouTube channel, which to some extent that is what they're going to be now. But I'm also going to specifically record these as podcasts, because the interview format, you don't necessarily always need to watch the video. Of course, it's nice sometimes to be able to watch the video and see facial expressions and interactions, you know, as we talk together. But you can also quite easily just listen to the audio of those. So with these podcast interviews that I'm going to be doing, as well as being able to watch them here on the YouTube channel, they are going to be published as podcasts. So you'll be able to find them on, you know, wherever you normally listen to your podcast, whether that be on Apple Music or Spotify or, you know, wherever that may be, it'll be published there as well. And so you can download it, and, you know, sometimes that can be a really great way, you know, so you can listen to it when you're driving or you know, something like that, to have that podcast format too. So yeah, I guess it's interesting because, again, when I planned to do these interviews before, it was just kind of as part of the YouTube channel. And I guess a big part of what's inspired me to start doing these interviews now is that I've been on 5 other people's podcasts so far this year, and I have a 6th one that I'm going to be on soon. I'm doing the interview for that next week. And so having done this, it got me thinking. I was like, you know what, I would yeah, I enjoy doing these, you know, talking to interesting people. Like, who doesn't enjoy talking to interesting people? Maybe I should start doing some of that myself, you know, given that I'm being interviewed on all these other podcasts. And it was only after actually starting to put this into motion and starting to interview a few people, because I've already recorded the first few interviews, so I'll come back to that later, that I then thought about it. I thought, like, actually, I was kind of basically planning to do this before the pandemic. And so it also feels really good in a way to finally finally be getting moving with some of those things that I was sort of planning and starting before the pandemic, finally be putting some of them into action again. Having started this with the podcast, I'm now sort of thinking more about some of those other things that I had planned and was working on before the pandemic. Maybe it might be time I might be able to start to move forward with some of those soon as well. I certainly hope so. I'm really looking forward to being able to do some of those things again, particularly some of the things like running retreats and workshops internationally, and some of all those other things as well. There's a few other projects that I was sort of starting into before the pandemic as well, and we'll see. It might be time to get moving on some of those as well. So what am I going to talk to people about in these podcasts? So the title of this channel is Chi Life, as you know. And chi means energy. Life, well, hopefully we know what life is. That requires no translation. And, at the moment, of course, on this channel, a lot of the time I end up talking about little details about things to do with Qigong, and which is great. I think there's some people out there who find that really interesting and useful. And I'll still do that from time to time as separate vlog videos that'll still be on this channel. There's no reason why I can't still have those vlog videos on this channel as well as these podcast interviews. And so I'll still do videos like that from time to time. But my aim with these interviews is to spread out the topics that I talk about and interview people about on this channel much more broadly. So again, if we go to the title of the channel, Chi Life, Energy and Life, there's so many different things that affect our energy in life. So a lot of the sorts of people who I'll interview and the things we'll talk about will be things to do with health and wellness, anything to do with our mind, our body, and our energy, really. And a lot of that does tie in with our health and our wellness. But sometimes it might also be things to do with culture. And sometimes simply people with really interesting stories about things that they've done in their life, which of course connects to our energy. So in a way, you could say it's not always going to be about Qigong anymore. Or is it? Because it really depends how you define Qigong. So certainly it's not going to be specifically about what we often think of as Qigong practices, formal Qigong practices. But if we take a broad definition of Qigong, well, that includes everything that affects the energy in our lives. And so in that sense, it's still very much going to be about Qigong. But we're going to be looking at a really broad array of different things that affect our energy in our life, and some really different perspectives as well. I'll say up front, I'm not necessarily going to agree with all of the perspectives of different people who I might interview, but I'm sure we'll be able to have really good, interesting discussions that, well, I think I'll find interesting, and other people, you listening to this this vlog and hopefully listening to some of those upcoming podcast interviews, will also find interesting and might get value from. We don't always need to agree with each other necessarily to have useful dialogue and learn interesting things. And so there's going to be a diverse range of different people who I interview on a whole lot of things. So as I mentioned earlier, I have actually already done the first few interviews, and I've got a few more lined up that I'll be doing shortly. And the very first interview is actually going to be a yoga teacher, right? So not Qigong again, or is it? Sometimes people, when they are wanting to help people to understand what Qigong is, or trying to communicate with an audience, because yoga is much more well known in the West than Qigong. I mean, Qigong is growing in awareness, very rapidly. People are starting to become aware of Qigong. But as of right now, lots more people know about yoga. And so sometimes people, when they're trying to communicate this to an audience, they might, sometimes they'll call Qigong Chinese yoga as a way to help people to get an idea of, what it is. Because yoga works with the mind, the body, and the energy in a certain sense, as does Qigong. So it's like, that's a kind of a Chinese version of yoga, which you already know about. Well, guess what? In China, I have heard people refer to yoga as Indian Qigong. So there really are a lot of similarities in many ways between the practices and the traditions and the philosophy. and of course some quite distinct differences that have been shaped by culture and by different focuses. And so I actually had a really interesting conversation with the first person who's going to appear in one of these interviews, someone who I know really well, and his name's AJ. Oh, I forget how to say his last name, but you'll see in the podcast episode. And he's Indian, and he grew up in India, and had quite an somewhat unusual time growing up, where he actually got exposed to a lot of yoga philosophy and practices, right while he was growing up, which in this modern day and age isn't all that common, even in India. But because of the school he went to and the environment he was in, he was exposed to a lot of this growing up. And then as a young adult, he moved to the West, first going to Canada and now in New Zealand. He's been in New Zealand for some time. And here he was exposed to yoga from a Western point of view, how Westerners are doing yoga. And he then went on to start to attend yoga classes and eventually do a yoga teacher training at a school here in New Zealand. And now he teaches yoga. And so really, really interesting, different perspective that he has, having come from his upbringing, being exposed to yoga philosophy and teaching and practices, and then tying that through into how we practice yoga in the West these days. So yeah, that's the very first person. It's not even a Qigong teacher, and that's going to be true of a lot of the people who I interview. They're going to be from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different traditional practices or modern practices, and things like that, but things that affect our energy, affect our mind, our body, our health, our well-being, and our journey through life. We've got some others coming up, people talking about different styles of breath work. I have someone talking about the role of ritual and ceremony in our lives. I have someone who has been working on creating, I don't know if I'd say it's their own practice, but their own format of working with practices to help people balance their essentially their body and their mind, their body, and their spirit, essentially, and sort of putting things together into a format to help people to make good habits around this. And he's putting together his own sort of programs to help people with that. And then I'm sure there will be lots of other interesting people who I interview as well. So I've been enjoying this process so far. It's a bit of work, to be honest, actually. Organizing people and interviewing them and then editing things and putting it all together, but really enjoyable. And so I hope that you're going to enjoy the interviews that come out of this and the different insights that come out of it as well. Now, as part of this, again, I'm new to this. I don't know that I'm going to say necessarily going to be hiccups along the way, but certainly I expect I'm going to learn things along the way, in terms of improving the quality of both from a technical point of view and the interviews and so on. And so, maybe bear with us if there's a few things like, that's not quite right to begin with. It's good. I think it's going to be pretty good to begin with. It's not like it's going to be terrible to begin with, but realize like, yep, okay, we're just getting started. There might be some room for improvement in some areas, but we'll work on that to hopefully make the podcast really enjoyable to listen to and to, and find out about all these different things that people out there are doing to work with their energy in their lives. What else do I have to say about that? I think that's probably about enough. The first episode of the podcast will come out probably later this week, I think. We'll get it all ready to go. And as I mentioned, that's going to be with a yoga teacher. I'm going to interview some Qigong teachers as well, of course. Obviously, I have a very strong interview in Qigong myself, and as part of that, I do come into contact with other Qigong teachers who sometimes do things in a similar way and have a similar perspective as I do, and other times do things in quite different ways and have quite different perspectives, and it can be really interesting to talk about those things together. That's the other thing I needed to mention in this video. If you think that you might like to be interviewed as part of the podcast, if you think you have some interesting things to talk about for about an hour or so, And that could be some practices that you do. It could be your own Qigong journey. It could be all sorts of things that you think might fit with this general topic of chi life, energy in our lives. Get in touch. You can just leave a comment below, I guess. That's one way you could do it. Or if you go to the longwhitecloudqigong.com website, you can find our contact details there. I think that's best. Rather than me putting my email address in the comments here, I suppose I could do that. Yeah, maybe. Well, I don't know. I'll either put my email address in the comments below, in the description below this video, or you can go to the longwhitecloudqigong.com website and send us an email and say, hey, I think I have something that would make for a good podcast interview. Get in touch, and we might be able to make that happen. A lot of the interviews, it's really nice to be able to do them in person. And so that's what I'm trying to do as much as possible. Now part of this as well, which might be interesting, some of these interviews are going to be recorded in different environments. Sometimes they're going to be indoors, sometimes they're going to be outdoors, so we might have a bit of ambient sound around us as well. Hopefully that adds to the character of the podcast. But as well as that, I will be doing some of those interviews online, just through video conferencing and recording it that way. So wherever you are in the world, if you think you'd like to maybe appear on the podcast, that could be an opportunity as well. All right, that's it for this episode of Chi Life. As I mentioned, there's going to be a strong focus on these podcast interviews going forwards, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be other videos as well. So if you really enjoy the other types of videos I make on this channel, don't worry, I still will be doing some of those from time to time, so you can look out for those as well. All right, I look forward to maybe seeing you in the comments of our first podcast episode later on this week.